The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Charles Christian and with me is Janie. This is episode 28, the 2nd of August edition of the Weird Tales radio show. We're here to take you on another foray into the world of ghosts, geeks, urban myths, magic and folklore. Before we launch into the second and concluding part of our interview with Andrew Beer Collins, here's Janie with a tale of a seasonal haunting. Or is it just a hoax?
Well, yes, you may ask. We're off to the village of Ingham in the Norfolk Broads, where it is said each year, on either the night of the 1st or the 2nd of August, a bit flexible, the stone statues of two medieval knights in armour rise up from their resting place inside the church, then walk down to the water's edge, where they then fight another night before returning to the church for another 12 months.
And the problem with this story?
Well, first the good news is there is actually a church at Ingham. It's the Church of the Holy Trinity, and it does contain two life-sized carved stone memorials of medieval knights in armour. One is to Sir Oliver de Ingham, who paid for the church to be rebuilt after the Black Death, and the other is to Roger Dubois. The latter curiously depicts Sir Roger resting his head on the decapitated head of another knight. There's a charming little thing there they used to do. Presumably this is to indicate Sir Roger was a valiant knight who fought the French.
Aha, and that presumably is the origin of the legend that on the night they walk, they head off and fight another knight before returning to the church.
Well, that's what I thought. But then I noticed who wrote the first reference to this haunting. Yep, it was our old friend, Charles Sampson. Ta-da!
Yes, good old Charlie Sampson, the author of the book Ghosts of the Norfolk Broads. Now, we've mentioned this writer before in one of our earlier shows, but for those of you unfamiliar with the story, here's a quick recap. Charles Sampson was a Harley Street physician who today would be called a raconteur and wit. He was an enthusiastic boater on the Norfolk Broads, and back in about 1930, one of the Broads yacht and cruiser hire companies commissioned him to write a series of ripping yarns and ghost stories to entertain people taking boating holidays on the Broads. You know the sort of thing. Tonight we're going to be moored next to the ruins of St. Benet's Abbey. I wonder if we'll see the ghost of the treacherous monk. Now, the clever thing about Sampson's stories is there was just enough detail in them to make them seem genuine. He'd use real place names. He'd invent credible-sounding eyewitness statements by named people. He'd cite references in impressively sounding but totally fictitious historical documents. And he'd take, embroider and generally elaborate on existing folklore tales. The end result was a great page-turner that's still in print today, nearly 90 years after the first edition. But it was a work of fiction. Unfortunately, sometime around the 1970s, a new edition of the book was produced by a different publisher, and somewhere along the way, the fact the stories were all made up was omitted, and many people came to believe it was a real ghost hunter's manual.
So you're saying take every story Charles Sampson tells, including the tale of the two knights of Ingham, with a great pinch of salt?
Very much so.
Yeah. Oh, and if you have a chance, also check out the E.E. Nesbit short story, Man's Size in Marble, it's called. It was first published in 1893, so that's about 40 years before Charles Sampson's Ghosts of the Norfolk Broads. Very scary story about statues of knights in armour that leave their tombs. Is that coincidence, or is imitation the sincerest form of flattery? Or is he just a beastly cheat and plagiariser?
That's a bit harsh.
Yes. No, I call it as it is. I'm sorry. Copyright and all that. He didn't realise there was going to be,
A podcast
Google.
show.
Oh, and a podcast.
To out him.
Yes. Got away with it, though, didn't he?
He did. And I say, still sells by the bucketload, that book. Right. Thank you, Janie. Now for the second and concluding part of our interview with the author Andrew B. Collins, where he explains how a relatively obscure archaeological site in Turkey, Gobekli Tepe, and some very recently discovered remains of a previously unknown branch of the human evolutionary family, the Denisovans, not only push back the earliest dates for the start of what we call civilization, but also turn many of our preconceptions about human beliefs and spirituality on their head. Obviously, one factor with the relatively slow spread is that at the time Gobekli Tepe was being constructed, parts of Western and Northern Europe were still recovering from the last ice age, weren't they?
It's no coincidence that Gobekli Tepe is constructed, within a couple of decades, within a generation or so of the end of the last ice age. In fact, it followed a 1200-year mini ice age known as the Younger Dryas, which would now seem to have been triggered by a massive impact event that occurred around 10,800 BC. It seems to have been caused by comet fragments that impacted the Earth, igniting large areas of the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in North America, creating a nuclear winter, creating the absorption of all of the water that had been held within the ice sheets that went up into the sky and then rained back down, seemingly as acid rain, and caused so much devastation and also triggered a mini ice age that we didn't really recover from this for throughout the whole duration of this period, which is around 1,200 years. And during this period, it would seem as if other bad things were going on as well, possibly other more minor cosmic events, more wildfires that burned for hundreds and hundreds of years, it would seem. It was a terrible time to have been around. And at the very end of this, Gobekli Tepe is constructed. And as I showed in an earlier book called Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, it's my belief that the construction of monuments like this was as a response to these cataclysms. People gathered together under probably the leadership of elite groups who probably came from outside the area, and probably involved, shamans and people with a lot of magical knowledge, who said, look, we can sort out your problem, but you must listen to us, do what we say, and we want you to create, these particular types of stone enclosures, and we will use them as an interface between this world and the other world, the invisible world that you normally connect with unless through dreams or altered states of consciousness.
Yeah.
And we will communicate, we will address, we will appease or deal with the supernatural forces that we believe are responsible for creating these catastrophes and convince them not to do it again. Now, this all might sound a little bit simplistic, but to be honest, all the way around the world, the appearance of comets and the potential of catastrophes being associated with them is associated with the supernatural, with harbingers of doom. And I think that this is something that goes back to the time of this cataclysm, and that that people believed that there were certain supernatural creatures that would create this, that would appear in the sky. Their visible manifestation was that of comets in particular. I mean, for instance, the comets and their tails have been associated with the tails of certain animals universally, particularly foxes and canines and wolves. I mean, the most obvious one of those, for instance, is Fenris of Norse mythology. I mean, a number of writers going back to Ignatius Donnelly back in about 1884 have suggested that Fenris is a memory of some kind of comet that appeared in our skies that brought, havoc and devastation with it. This is, again, something that I bring out in my Gobekli Tepe book. And I think this is correct. I really do believe this. And also there's imagery, particularly on the central monolith in what's known as Enclosure D in Gobekli Tepe, that these monoliths have like these belts, carved belts around them because they're anthropomorphic. Yeah. And you have right in the centre of this belt buckle, that's all you can describe it as. And the symbol on there is very clearly that of a three-pronged comet. Now, that's interesting in itself, but hanging beneath that is a carved relief of a fox pelt. And foxes would seem to have been very important at Gobekli Tepe in their rituals. A number of bones of foxes have been found in this context. And as I mentioned earlier, foxes would seem to have been directly associated with the tails of comets. So here you have two things together that seem to relate to the supernatural aspect of comets. Yeah. And what's weird is that even in British heraldry to this day, a symbol that is the comet is actually known as the foxtail. Mm-hmm. Even down to this day, which I find fascinating, that some of these folk ideas, this folk memory, can linger right the way through to the present day.
Yeah, I've got a website page up in front of me, and it's showing the Gobekli Tepe pillar with the sculpture of the fox on the side of it.
Yeah.
Gobekli Tepe was abandoned after 1,500 years. Yeah. So what happened then? What was the reason for that?
Well, I mean, some of my colleagues like to think that, it was deliberately buried, in a rush, in a hurry, maybe to preserve it for the future. Nice, interesting idea. But I think that the more prosaic answer is that whatever purpose there had been to construct these enclosures across an extended period, and I mean, remember, they weren't all built at the same time. It would seem as if one was in use, maybe two, maybe three, I don't know, and that then they would be decommissioned and broken up and then buried, and then another one built either on top of them or to the left or the right of them. And then they would be decommissioned and covered over, and eventually you'd create this layer cake of activity, which we call an occupational mound, a tel or tepe. And the tepe at Gobekli Tepe is around 300 by 200 meters in size, by about 15 meters in depth. Mm-hmm. And beneath there is potentially another 20 or 30 more different enclosures, which have yet to be investigated. At the moment, there are about 5 or 6 major ones, plus another 20 or so more minor enclosures that are much smaller and were constructed at a much later date. And this is the clue here, because the oldest of the enclosures at Gobekli Tepe are the most sophisticated. They're the largest, and the most incredible. Now, that's really interesting. The younger ones, not only do they change size to much smaller, but they also become rectilinear as opposed to ovoid or elliptical in shape. But by the end of it, they're just almost going through the motions. I mean, yes, they're still doing a couple of the stone pillars with the T shape, but they're so small now. They're only now about 1.5 meters in height. And it's almost like they're going through the motions towards the end, as if it's as if like they're doing it because they know they've got to do it for a reason, but it's now they almost can't be bothered to do it. And I get the feeling that whatever motivations were there at the original beginning start point are now gone. And I think that this tells me that the cataclysms no longer occurred and that there was no longer any reason to do and to create monuments like this anymore. The values had changed. Also, the orientation of the enclosures had changed. I mean, originally they're orientated almost north-south, and, all the best evidence seems to suggest they're pointed towards the bright star of the constellation of Cygnus, a star by the name of Deneb, and there's good reasons for that, which we can come on to. But by the end of it, the enclosures are now facing towards the rising of the setting sun at the time of the equinoxes and the solstices.
Right, yeah.
And it seems to be very clear that they're more interested now in the ripening of crops and the return of the sun each year, as opposed to whatever might have been of interest amongst the stars.
Yeah.
And this shows the presence now of the Neolithic Revolution and the importance of agriculture in the creation of these monuments. And I think that that's the reason why they're abandoned, because, whatever it was that motivated them in the first place was no longer there.
Yeah.
Now, it's possible there was some kind of cataclysm at 8,000 BC. I wouldn't ever discount that fact. And it's also possible that they did cover over some of the final enclosures to preserve them for the future. But having said that, if they wanted to do that, they could have taken more care, because they certainly destroyed a number of the stones within these enclosures before they did cover them over. And that talks to me about decommissioning. When you decommission something like a Christian church or a Hindu temple, there are certain rituals that you have to go through to make sure that the influence is no longer there, the spiritual influence. Most probably with Hindu temples. And I think that something similar was going on at Gobekli Tepe. And I think this is what you see when they cover them over and then build something else on top of them. You've only got to look at, let's say, Mayan temples in Central America to find very similar styles of activity going on there, that you would decommission a particular pyramid or a temple, cover it over, and then build the next one on top of that.
Okay, and you were just saying just then about the stars, what they were pointing to.
Yeah, this is something, again, that seems to go back a lot earlier before Gobekli Tepe and is carried forward as well from the time of Gobekli Tepe and moves into new areas. And that's the fact that they would seem to have seen the stars as extremely important to do with origin, possibly cosmic origins of the soul, the fact that there was some kind of sky world or upper world, we might call it heaven today, and that life emerges from there before incarnation and returns there in death. It's a universal practice, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. It's found amongst the Native American First Peoples, with a number of different tribes there that saw the Milky Way as the road or river to the sky world, and pinpointed a location on that Milky Way where the Milky Way faults into two separate streams. This we know today as the Cygnus Rift, or the Great Rift, or the Dark Rift. And it's marked by the stars of the constellation of Cygnus. And this seems to be a universal place of entrance into the sky world, which is found not just at Gobekli Tepe, because it seems as if all of the enclosures, the earliest ones, are focused towards that direction, but also amongst the pyramids of Egypt. For instance, at Giza, there is a position to the southeast of the three pyramids that were constructed around 2500 BC, where the three basic wing stars of Cygnus, because Cygnus is always seen as a celestial bird, very often its identity is associated with the soul, the swan, the goose, the eagle, the falcon, the vulture, even, as it's seen at Gobekli Tepe. All of these birds are associated with the transmigration of the soul in various different parts of the world. And going to Egypt, what we find here is that there is a position where the three wing stars can be seen to set down into the three main pyramids specifically.
Right.
But that's horizontal. If you then go overhead those three pyramids, the same three stars seem to define the geographical positions and relationship of those same three pyramids. Now, context is obviously important here, and in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh, for instance, at death, was seen to become the god known as Osiris. Now, Osiris wasn't just the god of the dead or the god of the underworld, but he was the dead god. His whole myth cycle surrounds the fact that he is killed by his trickster brother Set. And it's all about his wife Isis bringing him back to life and then producing their son Horus. Now, the mother of Osiris is Nuit, the sky goddess, and she is personified in the night sky as the Milky Way. And it was an American astronomer by the name of Ronald A. Wells who first realized that the manner that Nuit is depicted in ancient Egyptian art as this naked woman arching over the earth is exactly the same as the Milky Way as it's seen in the Northern Hemisphere. Her legs being the split of the Milky Way into two in the area of the Cygnus constellation, which would mean that Cygnus was in the area of the womb of the sky Nuit. And therefore, what he showed is that this whole cycle of the pharaoh returning back to the womb of his cosmic mother was the pharaoh returning back to the Cygnus constellation as the place of life and death,
right,
in a cosmic sense. And I think this is absolutely correct. And I think this is the reason why the three pyramids are very specifically orientated towards the Cygnus constellation. And I mean, it's there in other parts of the world, as I said, within the mound building cultures of North America. The main orientations of various of the mound complexes are towards two specific constellations. One is Orion, and the other is the Cygnus constellation. Why Orion? Well, because as in ancient Egypt, the first port of call, once the soul enters into the sky world, is the Orion constellation, which was known as Sar, which is a god in its own right. And it would greet the soul of the deceased pharaoh. He would then travel beyond that point along the Milky Way and tell the folk of the Milky Way, and then enter the sky world at the point corresponding to the womb of his cosmic mother, Nuit.
right.
And as these ideas are there, and they're at Gobekli Tepe. It would seem as if the monuments there performed in exactly the same role as the three great pyramids. I mean, exactly. I mean, they're all orientated towards the north.
Right, yeah.
And these ideas were remembered in that area of Gobekli Tepe and then form part of the religion of a culture that rose up in that same area known as the Sabians, who were star worshippers and they venerated the North, in particular the North Star, as the mystery of creation. Basically, they saw it as where souls come from and return to in death. And adding to the significance of Cygnus is the fact that a few thousand years before Gobekli Tepe, the stars of Cygnus had played host to the northern celestial pole. This is the turning point of the heavens. Mm-hmm. So for a period of around 3,000 years or slightly more, all of the stars would have revolved around the Cygnus constellation and this fork in the Milky Way. And this would have been very, very visually important because what it would have meant is that once every night, the Milky Way would have lined up perfectly north-south.
Yep.
So if you'd have looked north, you'd have seen that the Milky Way rising up like the trunk of a tree. And then it would have split in two at the Cygnus constellation, where, of course, you'd have had this celestial bird, if indeed it was seen as a bird at that time, and I think it was. Mm-hmm. And then you'd have seen the trunk of the tree split into two branches and head off towards the south. And it would have pivoted on that point, that fork of the Milky Way every night. And I believe that this is behind the different myths and legends to do with a cosmic tree, either in the extreme north or the centre of the world. And that from this, of course, we have ideas like Yggdrasil in Norse myths, which was in some traditions seen as existing in the extreme north.
Yeah.
Plus also in Finnish or Finno-Ugric tradition, there was a tree in the extreme north, which was also seen as the place of entry and exit to the sky world. It was a place that was guarded by a swan, and that the swan itself was, of course, a symbol of the constellation of Cygnus, as it is in most European countries today, within the sky lore of Greek Hellenic tradition that we've inherited.
You are listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian on internet radio and podcast.
Your subtitle of the Cygnus Key is "And the Birth of Egypt." So is your suggestion that the influences, culture that were behind Gobekli Tepe then moved out, and one of the directions it moved was through the Levant and into Egypt?
Absolutely. And again, we have another paper trail, as it were, if that's probably the right term. I'm not sure if it is, but certainly a stone trail.
Papyrus trail,
yes. Because there is a particular type of stone tool known as the Helwan point. That's Helwan. Mm-hmm. It's named after a site just a little way south of Cairo, within visual distance of the Giza pyramid field. And this type of projectile point is very distinctive in appearance. It has these notches on each side of it, these shoulders at the base of it, that allow it to be easily hafted onto an arrow shaft. And it was found there initially in the late 1800s. And examples of it were found at various points in various places in the Levant, including Jericho, for instance. And it was speculated on where the origin of this Helwan point may have been. And the conclusion is that it probably originated in the Middle Euphrates, probably around 7,000, 8,000 BC. But this was in the 70s, and since that time, a number of examples have been found as far north as Gobekli Tepe and other similar pre-pottery Neolithic sites in that region. And these definitely go back to 9000 BC in the context of where they were found, and arguably even earlier. And it becomes very, very obvious that the point of origin and the age of the Helwan point goes back to at least 9000 BC, and its place of origin is southeast Anatolia, in other words, modern-day Turkey. And it was here that it developed as part of the same tradition that would seem to have been coming into this country from the north via places like Georgia, Armenia, the Caucasus, and even further north into the Russian steppe and beyond that. And that this is part of a movement, an evolution of ideas that eventually goes through the Levant and ends up in Egypt by, it would seem, around 8000 BC. Because, I mean, a number of papers have been done in more recent times on the Helwan point, including one, a very important paper done by Professor Klaus Schmidt. Now, he's the guy that actually discovers Gobekli Tepe and realises its significance in 1994, and then becomes the guy that leads the excavations there every year through until his unfortunate death in 2014. And so, he was on to the significance of Helwan and the connection between this point and the pre-pottery Neolithic peoples of the region. And I think that this is not only right, but extremely important. So what it tells us is that the same people that were at Gobekli Tepe were also in northern Egypt by at least 8000 BC, and that they took over a settlement area at Helwan that was centered around a series of springs, different types of important springs that become important all the way down to the age of the pyramids construction around 2600 BC. And I show in the Cygnus Key book that all of these ideas almost certainly hang around in northern Egypt through until this time, and are then revitalized at the beginning of dynastic Egypt, which is why the same ideas that appear at Gobekli Tepe are also found in connection with the orientation and the design and also the geometry of Gobekli Tepe, because they also are present at Gobekli Tepe. What I show in the book, for instance, is that the earliest sophisticated enclosures at Gobekli Tepe have very specific geometry that's based on a 3-4-5 triangle or a 3-2 triangle, and these themselves relate to sound acoustics and the enhancement of sound. And I think that this is something that was very important at Gobekli Tepe, and these were ideas that were eventually carried into Egypt. But they're found also in megalithic monuments across Britain, particularly in areas like Gloucestershire and Wiltshire, in what we know as Wessex.
Yeah.
Work has been done down there on the acoustics of the chambers, and they also have been found to have enhanced sound acoustics relating to the 3-4 geometry, which relates to the musical interval known as the fourth. The 3-2 geometry relates to the perfect fifth.
Yeah.
And all of these ideas would seem to have been known by the ancients and would appear to have been incorporated into architectural design to somehow enhance the acoustics, not just for the sake of it, but because they seem to see these particular musical intervals as very, very important for some reason. And what's so interesting is going back to the area of the Altai Mountains and the Denisovans is that these same ideas in musical geometry and sound acoustics seem to be there as well. And there's a story about the giants, which, by the way, I forgot to mention that there's strong evidence from the the anatomical remains that we've got so far, that the Denisovans may have been of great size and stature.
Right.
Certainly some of them, at least, may have been as much as 7 to 7.5 feet tall.
Right.
And that's quite extraordinary. And it brings us into the realm of, the idea that they could actually be remembered as the giants of legend.
Yes.
Which is very, very interesting territory, of course. But in the Altai Mountains, we find that there are stories, not only the fact that the giants there may have been the earliest ancestors, some of the human clans and tribes, but also that they gave us a lot of firsts, everything from architecture to irrigation, and also the creation of musical instruments, in particular, that relating to an instrument known as the komis. And the komis is this stringed instrument which has a box, a bass-like case that has 3:4 ratio, or can have a 3:4 ratio shape to enhance its acoustics. It has a long neck that is deliberately shaped like a swan. A swan is the primary symbol of the music and the musical spheres in Greek Hellenic tradition. And also, it's very specifically tuned to a 3/4 musical interval, the perfect fourth, and that's part of it. And these ideas are allegedly come from these giants, the giants of the Altai region. So, this is a nod, as far as I'm concerned, that a lot of these ideas originally come out of the Altai Mountains and may well have had their origin with the Denisovans.
Right. That's excellent. Now, I'm conscious I've taken up a lot of your time, but you're also active in various conferences, events, and symposiums and tours over the next, I'm looking at, again, your website, over the next 18 months or so, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to simplify it all, if people are interested, everything I've talked about today can be found in my book, The Cygnus Key, which has the subtitle of The Denisovan Legacy, Gobekli Tepe, and The Birth of Egypt. Yeah. You can find that on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or if you're lucky, elsewhere. Yeah. Obviously, I did a book called Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, which has a lot about, Gobekli Tepe as a site and its connection with the Younger Dryas impact event, and why it was actually constructed. And I'm doing a new book, which has just been submitted to the publishers, which is going to be called Denisovan Dawn, which is all about almost like part 2 of the whole investigation into the Denisovans, in particular, their spread of influence, not just into Europe, which is a very interesting story, which, has to be believed, but also going eastwards, across through the Russian Far East and also through Southeast Asia and over the Pacific into the Americas, and what they were doing in the Americas. That's the next big thing, really. And that will be out next year. I'm writing that with my colleague Greg Little, who's an expert in the American Genesis and mound building cultures over there. And yeah, we're doing various tours. We're going to Siberia. We're going to the land of the Denisovans. We're going to the Denisova cave. We're seeing that beautiful Denisovan bracelet. Mm-hmm. We're going to Gobekli Tepe. It's now a UNESCO site. It's got a nice new roof on it, and it's open to the public. We're going there in October as part of a tour. If people are interested in any of this stuff, come on to www.andrewcollins.com. Mm-hmm. It's all there. Also, there's an emailer there that you can press, to connect with me, and also clearly, follow me on Facebook and also Twitter. Yeah. And there are links to those on the website. So yeah, I mean, I think in summary, really, all of this is in its infancy. These are brand new ideas that have only been around for a few years. We're learning all the time. The listeners out there may have a piece of the jigsaw that we've missed. So if some of this resonates with you and you feel you can add to it, by all means contact me. I'd be happy to hear from people.
That's brilliant.
And I'm flying off to America. I'll be at a conference there known as Arklantis. Notice what they've done there.
I saw that. That's very good. in Little Rock, Arkansas.
That's in September. I look forward to that, and maybe some of your American listeners maybe go to that.
Andrew, thank you ever so much for your time. Been wonderful listening to you. Very interesting material.
Thank you.
That's it, we're out of time. Janie and I look forward to joining you again next week, but until then, if you are still celebrating this week's Gaelic, Celtic, Wiccan, Neo-Pagan, you take your pick, Festival of Lughnasadh, or Lammas as it's also known, which marks the midway point between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox, here's some words for you. May your harvest be bountiful and sustain you through the cold winter months ahead. May the love of friends and family and your gods and goddesses warm you always. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist.icloud.com or on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.